What would you do if someone looked you in the eye and told you that you didn't belong in a place you had every right to be for 17-year-old Amara Ellis? It began as a routine morning flight to a youth leadership summit. She had her ticket. She had her assigned first-class seat, and she had her mother's words in her heart. Don't let anyone decide your worth for you. But when the lead flight attendant stopped at her row, the air shifted. Questions about her boarding pass, requests to move just for now, the subtle but cutting suggestion that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't meant to be there. Amara's calm refusal would spark a chain of events that no one on that plane could have predicted. A captain caught in the middle, a CEO's phone ringing mid-boarding, a career ending in minutes, and the beginning of something far bigger than one seat on one flight. What really happened in those tense minutes at 35,000 feet? How did one quiet act of resistance turn humiliation into hope and change an entire company? Stay with us. Like, share, and subscribe to Real Life Stories. New as we step into the moment, Amara refused to move, and the world started paying attention. The terminal was still half asleep, bathed in the dim blue of early morning. Amara Ellis walked through Chicago O'Hare with her carry-on rolling quietly behind her, the sound of wheels clicking over the polished floor in a steady rhythm. She was 17, traveling alone for the first time, and on her way to Boston for the National Youth Leadership Summit. Her mother had hugged her tight at the security gate and whispered the same words she always did before Amara faced something new. Don't let anyone decide your worth for you. Amara replayed that line in her head now as she found Gate C-12. The boarding sign above the counter glowed in soft letters. Flight 427 to Boston. Boarding first class. She had her boarding pass ready, printed neatly with Seat 1B in bold. It was a gift from her mother, who believed in sending her into new spaces with comfort and confidence. Boarding was calm. She walked the short jet bridge into the plane and stepped into the first-class cabin. The air smelled faintly of fresh coffee and lemon-scented cleaner. Plush leather seats lined both sides, their wide armrests inviting her to sink in. Amara slid into 1B, stowed her bag under the seat in front of her, and pulled out a worn, hardcover book. It had been her father's once, the inside cover marked with his neat handwriting. Just holding it felt like carrying a piece of him along. She'd barely read the first page when a shadow fell across her. Looking up, she saw the lead flight attendant, Janet Rourke. Her uniform was pristine, every button aligned, her blonde hair swept back into a perfect twist. The smile on her face was tight and didn't touch her eyes. "Excuse me," Janet said, her voice clipped. "May I see your boarding pass again?" Amara blinked, surprised. She held it out without hesitation. "Of course." Janet glanced at it, her brow furrowing. This doesn't look right. Are you sure you're supposed to be in this seat?" "This is my seat," Amara said softly, but with certainty. She'd learned from her mother that calm was its own kind of strength. Janet's eyes narrowed a fraction. "We'll need to verify this. For now, I'll ask you to move to another seat until we sort it out." Amara's stomach tightened. She looked down at the boarding pass, at the unshakable 1B printed in black ink. "I'm comfortable here. This is where I'm assigned." The cabin was still filling. A businessman in 1A was adjusting his tie and pretending not to listen, though his eyes flicked toward them. Across the aisle, an older couple sat very still, as if movement might pull them into the scene. Amara felt every gaze, every unspoken question. Janet didn't move. She stood in the aisle like a gatekeeper, her polished heels planted firmly on the carpet. "Miss, it's important for the boarding process that you comply. Please gather your things." Amara's fingers tightened around her book. She took a slow breath, steadying herself. The air seemed thicker now, heavy with an invisible pressure to yield, to shrink. From the row behind, a man's voice spoke gently. "Excuse me, is there an issue here?" She turned to see a distinguished older man with silver hair and a kind, lined face. He wore a navy blazer and sat with quiet authority. This was Thomas Avery, though she didn't know his name yet. Janet's smile returned, brittle as glass. "Nothing for you to worry about, sir. Just confirming a seating assignment." But Thomas didn't look away from Amara. There was something in his eyes, solidarity, maybe, or recognition of a scene he'd witnessed before. Amara's mind spun. She could call her mom right now, but she could also handle this herself. She remembered the way her mother's voice would firm up when challenged. "You have the right to be here. Don't apologize for it." Janet's tone sharpened. "Miss, I don't want to delay this flight. Please move to main cabin while we sort this out." The words main cabin hit harder than they should have. They weren't just about location. They were about belonging. Amara's voice came out low, even. "I'm not moving. This is my seat." A beat of silence followed. Janet's nostrils flared just enough to notice. "You're disrupting the boarding process," she said, her eyes sweeping the cabin as if to gather witnesses. The businessman in 1A shifted uncomfortably. The unspoken message was clear: comply or become the problem. Amara could feel her heart pounding, but she kept her face still. She tucked the book into her lap and folded her hands over it. The cabin around her seemed to shrink, every breath measured. She thought of her father, the quiet strength in his presence, the way he'd never have backed down from an injustice, no matter how small it seemed to others. From behind her, Thomas Avery leaned forward slightly. "If I may, I've been watching. The young lady's boarding pass matches her seat. There's no reason for this." Janet's smile flattened into a line. "Sir, please remain seated. I'm following airline protocol." The exchange hung in the air, uncomfortably public. Amara realized she was holding her breath. She let it out slowly, keeping her eyes on Janet, not in defiance, but in refusal to disappear. She had no idea that this was only the beginning, that before this plane left the gate, everything would shift. But in that moment, she knew one thing for certain: she would not give up her seat. Janet Rourke's stance in the aisle did not waver. Her hand rested on the back of the seat in front of Amara, fingers tapping against the leather like a quiet metronome counting down. The rest of the first-class cabin seemed to hold its breath. Amara's gaze stayed steady, her boarding pass still clutched between her fingers. She could feel the heat creeping up the back of her neck, not from shame but from the pressure of being scrutinized in a space where she knew she had every right to be. Passengers continued filing in from the jet bridge, the shuffle of feet and the rustle of coats filling the silence between them. A mother, guiding her young son, glanced at the scene and quickly looked away. The boy's curious eyes lingered until his mother tugged him forward. "I am going to need you to stand and move to the main cabin," Janet repeated. Her voice was calm but firm, the kind of tone used when the decision has already been made and the other person's opinion is irrelevant. "This is my assigned seat," Amara said again. She placed her book carefully in the seat pocket, her movements measured. My boarding pass is correct. I'm staying." Janet's smile flickered, the polite facade thinning. She straightened and scanned the aisle for support. "We can resolve this quickly if you cooperate," she said, her voice projecting just enough for nearby passengers to hear. "If you choose not to, you're creating a disruption to the boarding process." The businessman in 1A shifted again, clearly uncomfortable. Thomas Avery's eyes narrowed, his expression betraying a growing unease. He leaned forward slightly. "I'm a witness here," he said, his voice low but firm. "I saw her board." She showed her pass to the gate agent. "She belongs in that seat." Janet turned to him with a clipped nod. "Sir, I appreciate your concern, but this is between the passenger and the crew. We have to follow protocol." It was the third time she had used that word. Protocol. As if it were a shield she could raise to block any challenge. Amara could feel her palms growing damp. She slid her hands down the sides of her skirt to dry them, hoping the movement looked casual. Inside, her thoughts collided. She could end this in seconds by calling her mother. But a stubborn part of her whispered that if she did, she would be proving Janet right that she could not hold her own without someone stepping in. Her father's voice came to mind, from a memory years ago. He had been teaching her how to stand her ground in a school debate, telling her, "You don't have to raise your voice to be heard. Sometimes the quietest voice is the one people remember." She clung to that now. "Miss, please," Janet said, the tension in her tone more visible now. "I need you to stand up and let me escort you." Amara lifted her chin just slightly. "No." The single syllable hung in the air, sharp and deliberate. Janet's eyes hardened. A passenger 2 rows back pulled out a phone, not to film, but to scroll, though Amara suspected they were listening intently. Janet's voice took on an edge. "If you refuse to comply, I will have to escalate this matter to the captain." Amara gave the smallest shrug, as if to say, "Do what you have to do." But her heart was beating fast, each thud echoing in her ears. Janet stepped away, her heels clicking briskly down the aisle toward the cockpit. The moment she disappeared behind the curtain, the first-class cabin erupted in hushed whispers. Thomas Avery leaned toward Amara. "You handled that well," he said. His voice was even, but there was an undercurrent of concern. "But be ready. When a crew member frames something as a security issue, the captain usually backs them up." Amara nodded. She wanted to say something but found that her throat felt tight. She took a deep breath and let her eyes fall to her father's book in the seat pocket. She touched the edge of the cover with her fingertips like a talisman. The curtain parted, and Janet returned, this time with Captain Marcus Lane following close behind. He was tall, his uniform crisp, his hat tucked under his arm. His expression was neutral, but there was a formality to his movements that suggested he had already been briefed. "Ma'am," he said, addressing Amara directly for the first time, "the lead purser has informed me there is an issue with your boarding pass. I'm going to ask you to take a seat in the main cabin while we verify your credentials." "There is no issue," Amara said, her voice steady. "This is my seat." Captain Lane hesitated for a fraction of a second, then glanced at Janet before speaking again. "We can sort this out in just a few minutes, but I need your cooperation so we can depart on time." Amara's chest tightened. The logic was there, but the implication was the same: remove yourself quietly, or be labeled as the problem. She looked around the cabin. The mother and son from earlier were watching again. The boy's brow furrowed as if he could not understand why this was happening. The businessman in 1A kept his eyes fixed firmly on the magazine in his lap, turning pages too quickly to actually be reading. Thomas Avery cleared his throat. "Captain, I saw her boarding pass. It's valid. I believe this situation is unwarranted." Janet shot him a quick glare. "Sir, please let the crew handle this." Amara felt the pull of two impulses, one to stand and walk away to end the tension, and the other to root herself deeper into the seat, to claim the space she had every right to. She chose the second. "I'm not moving," she said again. Her voice was low but carried enough weight to cut through the quiet hum of boarding music overhead. Captain Lane exhaled slowly, the muscle in his jaw tightening. "Miss, refusing a crew member's instruction could result in removal from the flight." For a moment, Amara imagined what it would look like, her being escorted off. Passengers watching, someone perhaps filming. The story would be told in pieces, twisted by perception. She would become a headline, but not the one she wanted. She reached for her phone. Janet's eyes flicked to the movement. "Miss, please don't." But Amara was already scrolling to her mother's contact. She pressed the call button and lifted the phone to her ear. Her mother's voice came through on the second ring. "Amara, you're on the plane." "Yeah," Amara said, her voice still steady but her chest rising faster now. "They're trying to move me out of my seat." There was a pause on the other end, followed by a measured tone that Amara had heard in boardrooms and negotiations. "Stay where you are. Do not move." Janet's lips tightened, but she said nothing. Her mother's voice softened. "I'll take care of it. Just breathe." Amara ended the call and slid the phone into her lap, folding her hands over it. Around her, the passengers' eyes darted between her and the crew, sensing that the situation had shifted, though they did not yet know how. Janet stepped back, her hands clasped behind her, but the tension in her posture was unmistakable. Captain Lane looked toward the cockpit, as if calculating how much longer they could delay without causing a chain reaction of missed connections. The air in the cabin seemed heavier, as if every breath carried the weight of what would happen next. And, deep down, Amara knew the real confrontation had only just begun. Captain Marcus Lane stayed in the aisle longer than Amara expected. His eyes moved between her and Janet Rourke as if he were weighing something he could not quite say aloud. The hum of the aircraft's air system filled the space between words. The rest of the first-class cabin had gone completely still. The only sound, the faint rustle of a newspaper from somewhere in row 3. "Miss Ellis," he said, his tone careful. "I need you to consider the impact of your decision. If you remain in this seat, we may be forced to delay departure. That could cause a ripple effect for other passengers." Amara heard the reason in his voice, but underneath it was the same quiet assumption she had felt since the first moment Janet questioned her that her presence here was negotiable. "This is my seat," she repeated. Her voice was soft, but the words were immovable. "I've already boarded. I've shown my pass. There is nothing to consider." She could feel her pulse in her fingertips, the blood rushing to her hands as she gripped her book again. Across the aisle, an older woman adjusted her scarf and looked out the window, but her posture was angled just enough to keep the scene in view. In the row behind, Thomas Avery had straightened in his seat, a subtle declaration that he was ready to speak again if necessary. Janet folded her arms. "Captain, we cannot proceed with a passenger refusing to follow crew instructions. This is a clear violation." The way she said passenger carried a distance in it, as if Amara were not sitting right there. Amara's stomach tightened at the coldness in her tone. Thomas Avery's voice cut through the air, calm but certain. "Captain Lane, I was here when she boarded. Her boarding pass clearly shows seat 1B. I've heard nothing to suggest otherwise. This isn't about safety. It's about whether someone belongs in a seat they paid for." Several passengers turned toward him, some with faint expressions of relief that someone else was willing to speak. Janet's lips pressed into a thin line, her gaze moving quickly from Thomas back to the captain. Captain Lane took a breath, then exhaled slowly. "Mr. Avery, I appreciate your input, but the crew is responsible for ensuring everything is in order before we depart. We'll resolve this as quickly as possible." Resolve what exactly, Thomas asked. "The boarding pass matches the seat. That's the resolution." Janet shifted her weight and glanced toward the cockpit curtain. Her voice softened, but her words were edged. "Captain, I recommend we classify this as a potential security concern." Amara felt the words hit her like cold water. Security concern. She knew what that could mean. That phrase could shift the entire framing of this incident, recasting her as a possible threat in the eyes of airline protocol. And if that label stuck, her side of the story might never be heard. The captain's jaw tightened. He did not immediately agree, but he did not dismiss it either. Amara's phone vibrated softly in her lap. She glanced down, saw her mother's name flash across the screen, and answered immediately. "Mom," she whispered. "Amara. Dr. Selina Ellis said," her voice carrying that calm authority that could silence a boardroom. "Stay calm. I just got off the phone with Gregory Stanton." Amara's grip tightened on the phone. The CEO. "Yes," her mother said. "He knows what's happening. He's going to call the captain directly in the next few minutes. You don't move. Not an inch." Amara closed her eyes briefly, feeling both relief and a new wave of adrenaline. "Okay." When she looked up again, Janet was watching her, suspicion in her gaze. "Who are you speaking to?" "Miss Ellis." "My mother," Amara said, her tone neutral. Janet tilted her head. "And is she aware that you're holding up the boarding process for everyone else?" Amara didn't answer. Not because she had nothing to say, but because she sensed that every word now could be twisted. Thomas Avery spoke instead. "I'd suggest, Ms. Rourke, that you be careful with your phrasing. This young woman is not holding up anything. The repeated questioning of her seat assignment is—" A flicker of irritation crossed Janet's face. But before she could respond, the captain's radio crackled softly at his side. He stepped a few paces away toward the galley to listen. His back was straight, but Amara saw the slight tilt of his head as if he were receiving unexpected news. Janet noticed, too. She leaned subtly in his direction, trying to read his expression, but he turned slightly away from her. The first-class cabin seemed suspended in time. Passengers held still, watching from the corners of their eyes. A child's voice from the row ahead whispered to their parent. Why are they being mean to her? The parent shushed them gently. Captain Lane returned. His expression changed. It was hard to read, but the certainty in his movements had shifted. He faced Janet first. "Ms. Rourke," he said, his tone now clipped, "I need to speak with you in private." Janet blinked, then forced a small smile. "Of course, Captain." They stepped behind the curtain toward the galley. Amara's breathing slowed slightly. but the tension in her shoulders remained. Thomas Avery leaned toward her again. "Something's changed," he murmured. "I've seen this before in courtrooms. When new evidence comes in, the tone changes." A minute later, Janet returned, but the tight smile was gone. Her posture was straighter, almost rigid. Captain Lane followed close behind. "Miss Ellis," the captain said, addressing her directly, "you will remain in your seat." For a moment, the words felt unreal, as if she had imagined them. But then she saw the subtle change in the air, the way passengers glanced at one another, the way Thomas Avery's lips curved in the faintest smile. Janet opened her mouth, but the captain held up a hand. "Ms. Rourke, you've been relieved of duty for this flight. Please gather your belongings." The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. Janet's face drained of color. She glanced around the cabin, as if looking for someone to step in, but no one spoke. The businessman in 1A stared fixedly at the magazine in his lap. The couple across the aisle looked down at their hands. Janet adjusted her uniform jacket, lifted her chin, and began walking slowly toward the rear of the plane. Every step seemed deliberate, the sharp click of her heels echoing in the hushed cabin. As she passed Amara's seat, their eyes met for a brief second. There was no apology in her gaze, only a flash of something unreadable before she moved on. When she disappeared from sight, the captain turned to the rest of the first-class cabin. "We appreciate your patience. We'll be departing shortly." The shift in atmosphere was immediate. The whispers began again, but softer now, tinged with a mix of relief and curiosity. Amara sat back in her seat, her fingers still curled around her phone. She did not feel victorious. She felt exposed, like she had been standing under a spotlight for far too long. Thomas Avery leaned in once more. "You did well," he said quietly. "You kept your ground without raising your voice. That's not easy." Amara gave a faint nod. "It doesn't feel like I did anything. It just feels heavy." "That's how truth feels sometimes," he replied. Amara opened her book again, not to read, but to have something to hold. She kept her eyes on the page while her thoughts raced. The confrontation was over, but the echo of it still rang in her ears, and somewhere in her mind, a question began to form what would come of this once they were in the air. The aircraft door was still open, a stream of passengers making their way down the jet bridge. The hum of the ventilation system mingled with the muted shuffle of feet on carpet. Amara sat motionless in seat 1B, her fingers resting lightly over her phone as if it were the only steady anchor in a room tilting beneath her. She could feel the cabin's eyes brushing over her in waves, a glance here, a longer stare there, each one carrying its own silent question. What did she do? Why isn't she moving? Her phone lit up again. It was her mother, Amara. Dr. Selena Ellis said, her voice controlled and steady. "Gregory Stanton is calling the captain right now. This will be over in minutes. Stay calm." "Okay," Amara said. She wanted to believe it, but her body felt tight, her shoulders locked. "Remember," her mother added, "your job is to remain composed. Let them see that." The call ended. Amara lowered the phone to her lap, her heart pounding faster now, not from fear, but from the strange anticipation that comes when you know the current is about to change. At the front of the cabin, Captain Marcus Lane's radio buzzed against his belt. He unclipped it, pressing a hand to his earpiece as he listened. His face didn't move much, but something in his eyes shifted. He nodded once, quietly, then turned toward the cockpit phone mounted beside the galley. Passengers nearby leaned back just enough to try to catch a word. Amara could only hear the low murmur of the captain's responses. Yes, understood. I'll take care of it immediately. When he hung up, he took a moment before turning back toward the cabin. He didn't meet Amara's eyes at first. Instead, he stepped toward Janet Rourke, who was standing with her arms crossed halfway down the aisle. "Ms. Rourke," he said in a tone that had lost its earlier diplomacy. "You've been relieved of duty for this flight. Please gather your personal items and step off the aircraft." Janet blinked, as though she hadn't heard him correctly. "Captain, that is not a request," he said, his voice firm but not loud. "The decision has been made. You are to disembark immediately." A small ripple went through the first-class cabin, a sharp intake of breath here, a whispered exchange there. Amara felt it pass over her like a gust of wind. Janet's gaze swept the passengers, searching for someone to back her. The businessman in 1A looked away. The couple across the aisle stared at their knees. Even the flight attendant at the rear of first class busied herself with stacking cups, avoiding eye contact. "This is highly irregular," Janet said, her voice tightening. "I was following protocol." Captain Lane's reply was simple. "You can discuss it with management once we land. For now, you're off this flight." The words landed like a closing door. Janet adjusted her uniform jacket with a sharp tug, then began moving toward the front. Her heels struck the carpet with sharp, deliberate clicks, each one a note in the slow march of her departure. As she passed Amara, their eyes met for just a moment. There was no apology in Janet's look, no admission of wrong. But there was something else, a flicker of recognition that this moment would follow her far beyond this gate. When she reached the door, a ground agent stepped inside to meet her. They exchanged a few quiet words, and then she was gone. The agent stepping back into the jet bridge to close the door behind them. For a moment, the cabin felt lighter, as if some invisible weight had been lifted. Captain Lane turned back to the passengers. "Thank you for your patience. We'll be ready for departure shortly." He stepped closer to Amara. His voice was quieter now. "Miss Ellis, you'll remain in your seat. The situation has been addressed. If there's anything you need during the flight, please let the crew know." "Thank you," Amara said. Her tone was polite, but her mind was still catching up to the sudden shift. Thomas Avery leaned toward her from behind. "Well," he murmured, "that was quick." Amara glanced back. "It doesn't feel quick. It never does when you're the one in the middle of it," he said. But that young lady was decisive. As boarding continued and the new lead in first class, Isabella Cruz appeared. She was younger than Janet by decades, her dark hair pulled back in a neat bun, her eyes warm but careful. She bent slightly toward Amara. "Ms. Ellis, I'm sorry for what happened earlier," Isabella said quietly. "If you need water or anything else before we take off, please let me know." "Thank you," Amara said, meeting her eyes. "I appreciate it." The sincerity in Isabella's face lingered for a moment before she straightened and moved to assist another passenger. Amara let herself exhale slowly. The confrontation was over, but the feeling of being under a microscope remained. She could still sense eyes on her, some curious, some sympathetic, some avoiding her entirely. She thought about her mother, somewhere back in Chicago, likely pacing her office while pretending to continue her workday. She thought about Gregory Stanton, the airline CEO she had only heard of before today, making a phone call that altered the course of this flight. And she thought about her father, whose book still sat in the seat pocket, as if waiting for her to pick it up again and remember that her story was hers to claim. The announcement for final boarding echoed faintly from the jet bridge. The cabin door closed with a solid thud, sealing them in. Amara felt the change in air pressure, the way the space shifted from public terminal to private journey. Captain Lane's voice came over the intercom. "Flight attendants, prepare for departure." The cabin light softened. Amara rested her head back against the seat and closed her eyes for a moment. She was not sure yet what this would mean for Janet, for the airline, for herself, but she knew this. She had not moved. She had stayed exactly where she was meant to be. As the plane began to push back from the gate, she opened her eyes and glanced at the window. The morning light was spilling across the tarmac, catching on the wings in a pale shimmer. The engines hummed louder, and the ground outside began to slide away. Beside her, the businessman in 1A finally spoke, his voice low. "I'm glad you didn't give up your seat." Amara turned slightly toward him. "Thank you." He gave a small nod and returned to his magazine, though his eyes no longer seemed to be avoiding hers. The aircraft rolled toward the runway, the sound of wheels over pavement a steady reminder that the journey was still ahead. And in Amara's chest, the tightness began to ease, replaced by something she could not yet name. She didn't know it, but the real story, the one that would follow her long after she landed, was only beginning to take shape. The seatbelt sign chimed as the plane leveled out above the cloud line. The cabin lights warmed, casting a soft glow over the rows of first-class seats. The tension that had gripped the cabin during boarding seemed to loosen, but it didn't disappear entirely. It hung in the air like the faint scent of coffee that lingered from the galley. Amara sat back in her seat, feeling the vibration of the engines through the floor beneath her feet. She had kept her composure. But now that the confrontation was over, a delayed wave of exhaustion began to creep into her shoulders. She pressed her fingertips lightly to her temple and breathed out slowly. From the aisle, Isabella Cruz approached, holding a small tray. On it sat a glass of water, a folded napkin, and a small packet of almonds. "I thought you might like something before we start service," Isabella said quietly, leaning in so that her words wouldn't carry no charge. Amara's eyes softened. "Thank you. That's kind of you." Isabella gave a small smile, the kind that carried both sincerity and a touch of hesitation, as if she were still navigating the fine line between doing her job and expressing her own thoughts. "If you need anything else, please just ask." As Isabella walked away, Amara glanced across the aisle. The couple who had been silent during boarding now met her gaze for the first time. The woman gave a faint nod, a silent acknowledgement that said, "We saw what happened." The man beside her shifted, almost as if to say something, but then settled back in his seat. From behind, Thomas Avery's voice carried softly over her shoulder. "You should know. What you did back there, it mattered." Amara turned slightly. "It just felt like I was sitting still." "That's exactly why it mattered," Thomas replied. "Sometimes the hardest thing to do is to stay put when every bit of pressure around you is telling you to move." She thought about that, turning his words over in her mind. Staying put had been harder than she wanted to admit. Every moment had been a tug-of-war inside her, between wanting to keep the peace and wanting to defend the space she was owed. Even now, a part of her questioned whether she had escalated things by not complying. But another part knew that if she had given in, the quiet sting of it would have followed her far longer than this flight. The flight attendants began moving through the aisle with the first-class meal service. Isabella stopped at Amara's row again, smiling faintly as she set a tray in front of her. The smell of roasted vegetables and fresh bread rose in the air. "You're vegetarian, right?" Isabella asked. Amara blinked. "How did you—" "I checked your ticket notes," Isabella said with a shrug. "Just wanted to make sure you got what you needed." It was a small thing, but it felt like a bridge, in a space that had felt so hostile minutes ago. The gesture cut through the tension like a shaft of sunlight. Halfway through the meal, Amara became aware of the subtle glances from other passengers. A man 2 rows ahead kept turning in his seat, as if curious but unsure whether to say something. The businessman in 1A, who had been silent since boarding, finally spoke. "I misjudged you," he said without preamble. Amara looked up from her tray. "Excuse me earlier," he said. "I assumed you were, well, causing trouble. Then I realized I hadn't seen your boarding pass, hadn't heard your side. I just went along with the assumption." His bluntness surprised her. "Thank you for telling me." He nodded once, his gaze steady. It's easy to believe the first thing we're told, harder to stop and ask why. Amara appreciated the honesty, even if it came late. "I guess we're all learning something today." The hum of conversation in the cabin grew as people settled into their meals. Amara took a sip of water, but the dryness in her throat had less to do with thirst and more to do with the way her mind kept circling the morning's events. She thought about Janet Rourke, now off the flight entirely. She wondered what was going through her mind as she walked back through the terminal. Was she angry, embarrassed, or did she still believe she had been right? Her thoughts drifted to her mother. She imagined Dr. Selina Ellis in her office, speaking with Gregory Stanton in that calm, decisive tone. That one phone call had flipped the entire situation. It made Amara realize how much power could change hands in moments, and how often that power was invisible until it was used. Isabella returned to clear her tray. "We'll have dessert soon. Would you like anything in particular?" "Something chocolate, if you have it," Amara said with a small smile. "Coming right up." When Isabella left, Thomas Avery leaned forward again. "May I give you some advice?" "Of course. Write down everything that happened," he said. "Not later tonight. Today, while it's fresh, people's memories get hazy, and the details will matter." Amara tilted her head. "You think I'll need it? I think you'll want it," Thomas said. "Stories like this have a way of growing beyond you. Better to have your own record." She thought about that, imagining herself in a week, a month, a year, trying to remember exactly how the air had felt in the cabin, the exact shade of Janet's expression when the captain relieved her, the sound of her own voice saying, "I'm not moving." She nodded. "I'll do that." By the time dessert came, the plane had crossed into smooth air. The windows revealed a sea of white clouds stretching to the horizon, glowing in the afternoon sun. Amara picked at the chocolate tart on her plate, her mind drifting again to the question she couldn't shake: what would happen next? Not just on this flight, but after they landed. She had a feeling the story wouldn't stay contained to these walls of aluminum and glass. As the dessert plates were cleared, Captain Lane's voice came over the intercom, calm and measured. "Ladies and gentlemen, we appreciate your patience today. We're cruising at 37,000 feet, making good time to Boston. We'll update you as we approach our destination." His voice carried no hint of the tension that had played out earlier, but for those in first class, the memory was still fresh. Amara leaned back, watching the sunlight shift across the wing. She felt a little more grounded now, as if the altitude had thinned the weight pressing on her earlier. But she also knew that altitude was temporary. The landing would bring her back into a world where people would ask questions, some with genuine curiosity, others with judgment already in place. She rested her hand lightly on the armrest, fingers brushing the smooth leather. For now, she was still in her seat. For now, that was enough. The low hum of the engines was almost soothing now, but Amara's thoughts refused to settle. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, feeling the faint vibration of the aircraft through her fingertips. The confrontation was over, yet its echoes lingered. Every time a passenger walked past her seat to reach the lavatory, she felt their eyes flick toward her, a split-second glance that carried curiosity, sympathy, or something she couldn't quite name. Isabella Cruz came by again, this time carrying a small tray of tea. "Chamomile," she said quietly, setting it gently on Amara's tray table. "I thought it might help you relax." Amara offered a grateful smile. "Thank you, Isabella." The young attendant hesitated, then leaned closer. I want you to know. I was at the back during boarding. I heard the way she spoke to you. This wasn't about protocol." Amara nodded slowly. "I know." Isabella's eyes softened. "Most of us try to treat people right, no matter what. But some, they've been doing this so long, they think the rules are there to protect them, not the passengers." Amara could see the tension in Isabella's jaw, as if saying those words out loud came with its own risk. "I appreciate you telling me," she said. "It means something." Isabella straightened, offered a polite nod, and moved on. The tea's warmth seeped into Amara's hands as she cradled the cup. The aroma was calming, but her mind kept replaying the morning in sharp detail the moment Janet's shadow fell over her seat. The disbelief in her voice, the weight of every passenger's stare. It felt like a scene that had burned itself into her memory. From behind, Thomas Avery spoke again. "You're quiet." Amara turned her head slightly, just thinking about what she hesitated, then admitted, about whether I should have just moved. It would have been easier. Thomas shook his head. "Easier in the moment, maybe. But later, you'd regret it. You'd wonder what would have happened if you stayed. That question can follow you for a lifetime." Amara looked down at her tea. "Maybe. But it still feels heavy." "Of course it does," he said. "Doing the right thing often does." She thought about that as the minutes passed. The flight attendants began preparing for the next service. The clink of silverware and soft chatter filling the cabin. Amara sipped her tea slowly, letting the quiet moments stretch. Then, from further back, she heard a whisper. "That's her," a woman's voice said. "The girl from the front." Amara didn't turn around, but her spine stiffened. She wasn't sure if it was meant to be admiration or gossip. Either way, it reminded her that she had become an event, a story already being told and retold before the plane even landed. A little later, Isabella returned with a discreet envelope. She leaned in. "This just came through from the gate. The captain asked me to pass it to you." Amara took it carefully. Inside was a handwritten note on airline stationery, Miss Ellis. I apologize for what happened today. I assure you this will be addressed at the highest level. Please let me know if there's anything you need upon arrival. Gregory Stanton. She read it twice. The ink pressed firmly into the paper as if the writer wanted each word to leave a mark. She folded it and slid it into her book, where it would be safe. Looking out the window, she saw the late afternoon light painting the clouds in gold. It should have been a beautiful moment, but instead it felt like the quiet before something larger. She had no doubt this incident would follow her beyond this flight. The only question was how far. The captain's voice came over the intercom. We're beginning our initial descent into Boston. Please ensure your seat belts are fastened and your seat backs are upright. Amara placed her empty cup on the tray table and buckled her belt. Her heart began to pick up again. She wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the anticipation of seeing her mother, or the thought of stepping off the plane into the public terminal where phones would be out, eyes watching. Thomas leaned forward once more. When we land, there's going to be attention. The CEO meeting you at the gate is going to make that happen. Be ready to decide how much you want to say. Amara nodded slowly. I'm not sure yet. That's fine, Thomas said. Just remember, once you speak, you can't take it back, but your silence can be powerful too. The descent grew bumpier, the engine shifting pitch as the plane cut through patches of turbulence. Amara gripped the armrest lightly, focusing on her breathing. Outside, the clouds broke apart, revealing glimpses of the city below. As the landing gear extended with a distant thud, she felt the cabin's mood shift again. The earlier tension had dissolved into a kind of polite distance. Passengers busying themselves with gathering belongings, checking phones, slipping on jackets. It was almost as if no one wanted to acknowledge what had happened in the first hour of the flight. The plane touched down with a firm bump, the engines roaring as the brakes engaged. They slowed quickly, the runway rushing past in streaks of gray and white paint. As they taxied toward the gate, Amara felt that familiar mix of relief and dread. The flight was over, but the real impact might be waiting just outside the cabin door. She thought again of her mother's voice, calm and certain. Stay where you are. Let them see that. The seatbelt sign went off. Passengers rose to gather their things, the narrow aisle filling with movement and the scent of fabric softener and perfume. Amara stayed seated, her bag still under the seat in front of her. Thomas stepped into the aisle, paused, and looked down at her. Whatever happens out there, you handled yourself well in here. Thank you, she said quietly. The line of passengers shuffled forward. From the front of the plane, Isabella gave Amara a small nod, an unspoken goodbye laced with respect. When it was finally her turn to stand, Amara straightened her jacket and stepped into the aisle. The air felt cooler near the open door, and beyond it she could see the jet bridge, and at the far end, 2 figures waiting. She knew one of them was her mother. The other, she guessed, was Gregory Stanton. The line of passengers moved forward in uneven bursts. Amara stood in the aisle, her carry-on at her side, feeling the subtle sway of the aircraft as the jet bridge locked into place. The air near the open door smelled faintly metallic, mixed with a hint of jet fuel drifting in from outside. She could hear voices beyond the threshold, low and purposeful. Isabella Cruz stood at the door, greeting each passenger with a warm smile as they stepped into the bridge. When she saw Amara, her expression shifted into something softer. "Take care, Ms. Ellis," she said quietly, and, I hope I see you again under better circumstances." Amara nodded. "Thank you for everything." Stepping into the jet bridge was like moving from one world into another. The air was cooler, sharper, and the echo of her footsteps bounced off the narrow walls. At the far end stood two figures, one tall, broad-shouldered man in a dark suit, and a woman in a sleek navy coat whose eyes found Amara immediately. Her mother's stride quickened. "Doctor." Selina Ellis closed the distance in seconds, pulling Amara into a firm embrace, the familiar scent of her mother's perfume wrapped around her like a shield. "You did exactly what you should have," she murmured. "I'm proud of you." Amara let herself lean into the hug for a moment, the tension in her shoulders easing just enough to breathe fully again. When they pulled apart, her mother's gaze swept over her, checking for signs of anything more than emotional strain. Satisfied, she stepped aside so Amara could face the man beside her. Gregory Stanton, CEO of the airline, extended his hand. He was in his mid-50s, his salt and pepper hair neatly combed, his expression grave but not cold. "Ms. Ellis," he said, "I owe you an apology. We failed you today." Amara shook his hand. His grip was steady, his eyes fixed on hers. "Thank you for saying that," she replied. "This isn't just about one person's behavior," Stanton continued. "It's about the culture that allowed it to happen. That's on us. I promise you, it will be addressed." Her mother's eyes flicked toward him, her voice calm but carrying an edge. "Gregory, I'm holding you to that, and I expect to see action, not just words." "You will," Stanton said, without hesitation. They began walking toward the terminal, the steady rhythm of their steps matched by the murmur of travelers on either side. People glanced at them as they passed, some curious, some clearly recognizing Stanton and wondering why he was escorting a young passenger through the terminal. When they reached a quiet seating area near a set of large windows, Stanton gestured for them to sit. "I wanted to speak with you before the story gets ahead of us," he said. "Word travels fast in airports and even faster online. We already have reports that passengers were posting during boarding." Amara's brows drew together. So people were talking about it while it was happening. Her mother gave a small, knowing smile. "Welcome to the modern world. Everything is a headline before you even have a chance to tell your own version." Stanton leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "If you're comfortable, I'd like to hear exactly what happened from your perspective. The official report will only give me the sanitized version." Amara recounted the sequence of events in careful detail. Janet's first approach, the repeated requests to move, the growing attention from the cabin, Thomas Avery speaking up, the captain's involvement, and, finally, the phone call from her mother that set everything in motion. Stanton listened without interruption, his gaze steady, nodding occasionally but never looking away. When she finished, he sat back, exhaling slowly. "That aligns with what I've been told by two other passengers who reached out to us directly. Which means this isn't just a matter of perception, it's a matter of record." Selina's voice cut in. "And what will you do about it?" Stanton's reply was immediate. "We've already suspended Janet Rourke pending investigation. But beyond that, we're launching a full review of our training programs and reporting protocols. Too often, these situations are justified under vague terms like protocol or security. That stops now." Amara listened, unsure how much to believe. His words sounded firm, but she had heard enough from her mother about corporate promises to know that follow-through was what really mattered. "Why me?" she asked suddenly. Stanton frowned slightly. "What do you mean? Why was I singled out?" There were other passengers. No one else was asked to move. The silence that followed stretched just long enough to be uncomfortable. Stanton's eyes flicked toward Selena, then back to Amara. "I can't speak for her mindset, but I can say this bias doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it hides behind procedure." Her mother's hand rested lightly on her arm. "That's why we push back, Amara, so it can't hide." For a few minutes, they sat in a quiet that wasn't entirely awkward. Beyond the glass, planes taxied in the fading light, their tails catching the last colors of sunset. Inside, the terminal buzzed with the movement of travelers, the sound of rolling suitcases and boarding announcements a constant backdrop. Thomas Avery appeared then, walking toward them with the unhurried stride of someone who had nothing to prove. He greeted Selena politely before turning to Amara. "I thought I'd check in before I head out." "You holding up? I think so," she said. Stanton stood and extended his hand to the retired judge. "I understand you spoke on Ms. Ellis's behalf during the flight." "Thank you." Thomas shook his head. "No thanks needed. I saw something wrong and I said so. More people should." Selena glanced at him with clear appreciation. "You've got the kind of voice people listen to." Thomas's eyes twinkled faintly. "Maybe, but hers," he nodded toward Amara, "is the one they'll remember." After a few more words, Thomas excused himself, disappearing into the flow of travelers. Stanton checked his watch. "I'll be in touch within the next week. I'd like you both to review our proposed changes before they're made public." Selena nodded once. "We'll hold you to it." When Stanton left, the terminal seemed to grow louder, as if his presence had muted the background noise and now it had rushed back in. Amara and her mother sat side by side, watching the light fade from the sky. "You okay?" Selena asked gently. Amara thought about it. "I'm tired, but I'm glad I didn't move." Her mother's lips curved into the faintest smile. "You'll be glad for that for the rest of your life." They sat in silence for a while longer before finally rising to leave. The city awaited, along with the leadership summit that had been the entire reason for this trip. But Amara knew that what had happened on the plane would follow her into every room she walked into for a long time to come. For now, though, she had her mother's steady presence beside her, and the knowledge that she had held her ground when it mattered most. That, she thought, was enough for tonight. By the time Amara and her mother reached the hotel that evening, the events of the day were already taking on a life of their own. The first clue came in the form of Selena's phone, which buzzed nonstop from the moment they stepped out of the taxi. Board members, colleagues, and even friends she hadn't spoken to in years were forwarding screenshots and links. Someone had posted about the incident on social media, a vague but detailed enough account to paint the picture. It was from a passenger who had been sitting in row 3. They had written about how a young black girl in first class had been repeatedly asked to move despite showing her boarding pass. The post described the intervention of another passenger, the call to the CEO, and the lead flight attendant's removal from the aircraft. The comment section was already swelling with outrage. Some demanded the airline issue a public apology. Others speculated about the motives behind Janet Rourke's actions. A few skeptics questioned whether the situation had been exaggerated, but their voices were drowned out by those insisting that this kind of bias had to be confronted. In a suite high above the city, Amara sat cross-legged on the bed, scrolling through her own phone. Her name hadn't yet been connected to the post, but she knew it was only a matter of time. She glanced toward her mother, who was seated at the desk, laptop open, speaking quietly into a headset. Selena's voice was measured, the way it always was when she was in problem-solving mode. "Yes, Gregory, I've seen the post," she said, "and yes, it's already getting traction. You need to decide now whether you're going to control this narrative or let it control you." She listened for a while, her brow tightening. "Good. Then start by issuing a statement tonight. Keep it simple. Acknowledge the incident. Apologize, and make it clear the investigation is already underway." When she ended the call, she swiveled in her chair to face Amara. "It's moving faster than I expected. Gregory's team is going to put out a statement within the hour." Amara set her phone down. "So, it's going to be public." Selena nodded. "It already is. The only difference now is whether your name gets attached to it. That's your choice." Amara thought about it for a long moment. She didn't want to be reduced to a headline, but she also knew hiding entirely might send the wrong message. "I'll think about it," she said. Meanwhile, in another part of the city, Janet Rourke sat in her apartment, staring at her own phone. Her day had unraveled with dizzying speed. After being escorted off the flight, she had been met at the gate by 2 airline managers who informed her she was being placed on immediate suspension without pay. They had taken her ID badge and company-issued tablet before walking her to the employee exit. She had spent the ride home drafting her own version of events. In her account, she had been enforcing standard seating verification after noticing a discrepancy. She told herself the passenger's resistance had been unusual, even suspicious, and that her decision to involve the captain had been purely procedural. By the time she opened her laptop, her hands were trembling. She logged into a flight attendant forum, typing out a post asking for advice. Within minutes, responses poured in, some sympathetic, others brutally honest. A few told her flat out that she had mishandled the situation, that perception mattered as much as procedure, and that a first-class passenger who had already shown a valid boarding pass should not have been targeted again. Janet slammed the laptop shut. She needed a different kind of ally, someone who could defend her publicly. That's when she called her union representative, who advised her to say nothing until they had a strategy. Back at the hotel, Selena's phone buzzed again. This time it was an email from Gregory Stanton with a draft of the public statement. She read it aloud to Amara. "The airline acknowledges an incident on Flight 427 involving the reassignment request of a first-class passenger. The passenger remained in her assigned seat, and the crew member involved has been relieved of duty pending investigation. We are committed to ensuring that all passengers are treated with respect and fairness." Amara considered the words. It doesn't say why it happened. Selena gave a faint smile. "They'll never say that outright. Not yet. But trust me, this is stronger than most first statements you see." The next morning, the story appeared on 2 local news sites. They didn't have Amara's name, but they had quotes from passengers. One was from Thomas Avery, who described what he saw in calm, precise language. There was no confusion about the seat. The young woman had a valid boarding pass. The repeated questioning was unnecessary. The coverage triggered more online discussion. A few former passengers claimed they'd had similar run-ins with Janet Rourke, describing moments when she had spoken to them in ways that felt dismissive or hostile. Someone even posted an old photo of her from a crew appreciation event, identifying her by name. By midday, Selena's phone rang again. It was Gregory. "Janet's name is out there now," he said. "Her lawyer has contacted us, threatening to sue for wrongful termination if we move forward." Selena's tone stayed even. "And what are you going to do?" "Proceed," Gregory said. "We have multiple passenger statements, and our own internal logs back up their accounts. If she wants to fight it, we'll fight." Amara listened from across the room, feeling a strange mix of satisfaction and unease. She didn't want revenge, she wanted change. But she knew sometimes one led to the other. That night, as the city lights glittered outside the hotel window, she sat down with her notebook and began to write. She described every moment of the encounter, from the sound of Janet's heels on the carpet to the exact pitch of her voice when she said, "Please move to the main cabin." She wrote about the way the cabin seemed to close in, about Thomas Avery's calm interjections, about the way her hands had shaken even though her voice stayed steady. When she finished, she read the pages back slowly. It was all there, the facts, the feelings, the subtle details no one else would ever notice unless they had been in her seat. She closed the notebook and placed it on the nightstand. Whatever happened next, she would have her own record. By the third day after the incident, the story had broken beyond the aviation blogs and local news. National outlets were calling Selena's office, asking for interviews with her and with Amara. Selena kept declining, insisting that her daughter needed space to focus on the leadership summit she had traveled for. But behind the scenes, the situation was shifting from a PR flare-up to a full-scale legal conflict. Janet Rourke's lawyer held a press conference outside a downtown office building, flanked by two assistants and holding a prepared statement. He framed Janet as a loyal employee, wrongfully targeted in a political move. He described her as a dedicated flight attendant of 22 years who had been unfairly vilified in the court of public opinion. According to the lawyer, Janet had followed protocol after observing a potential ticketing discrepancy. He claimed the captain's decision to remove her from the flight was made under duress, after a call from an executive with a personal connection to the passenger. The lawyer didn't name Selena directly, but his implication was clear. The press conference was live-streamed, and by the time it ended, Selena had already received 6 emails from journalists asking for a response. Gregory Stanton called her directly. "She's trying to reframe the whole thing," Gregory said, his voice tight, "and she's hoping we'll back down to avoid the optics of a drawn-out fight." "Are you backing down?" Selena asked. "Absolutely not," Gregory replied. "Our investigation is nearly complete. Multiple witness statements confirm what happened, and the flight security logs match your daughter's account. But we need to be strategic. The longer this drags out, the more she'll try to spin it." That same afternoon, Thomas Avery sent Selena an email. Attached was his signed statement, given in formal, legal language. In it, he recounted the events with meticulous detail, every question Janet asked, every refusal from Amara, the captain's initial deference, and the exact moment the CEO's call came through. "Use this however you see fit." Thomas wrote in the email body, "I'm not afraid to go on record." When Selena read it aloud to Amara, her daughter felt a strange sense of relief. It was one thing to remember the incident herself, another entirely to have someone else's words confirming it without hesitation. 2 days later, the airline released its official findings. The report was short but decisive. It concluded that Janet Rourke had acted outside of standard procedure, had failed to de-escalate a non-disruptive passenger interaction, and had misrepresented the nature of the situation to the captain. Her removal from the flight was described as necessary and appropriate under the circumstances. The company's legal department sent Janet a termination notice effective immediately, citing breach of conduct and violation of the airline's non-discrimination policy. Alongside it came a cease and desist letter addressing public comments she had made that the airline deemed defamatory. Janet's lawyer responded within hours, filing a lawsuit claiming wrongful termination, defamation, and emotional distress. He demanded reinstatement, back pay, and damages. The news cycle seized on the development, framing it as a high-stakes standoff. Some headlines painted Janet as a whistleblower punished for challenging a powerful passenger. Others emphasized the findings of the internal investigation and the witness accounts that supported Amara. Amara tried to keep her focus on the summit, but the constant buzz of her phone made it impossible to escape entirely. Even some of the other students had heard pieces of the story, though most didn't connect her to it until she confirmed it herself. When they realized, the conversations turned into a mix of support and curiosity. One evening after the day's events, Isabella Cruz called Selena. Her voice was hesitant at first, but then she spoke with a quiet urgency. "I haven't given a formal statement yet," Isabella said. "I was hoping it wouldn't come to this, but I can't stay silent anymore. I saw the whole thing, and I saw how Janet looked at your daughter like she didn't belong before she even sat down." Selena's tone softened. "If you're willing to put that in writing, it will make a difference." "I'll do it," Isabella said, "but I'd like to remain anonymous if possible. I still have to work with these crews, and there are people who would make my life difficult if they knew I spoke up." Selena assured her they'd protect her identity as much as possible. The next day, Isabella's statement arrived. It matched almost exactly with what Amara and Thomas had already described, adding details from the perspective of someone who had been working in the cabin that morning. Gregory Stanton wasted no time. With these combined accounts, his legal team filed a counterclaim against Janet for defamation and legal costs. The filing was blunt. It accused her of deliberate misrepresentation and publicly undermining the company's credibility. The counterclaim, once leaked to the press, turned the tide. Media outlets that had previously given weight to Janet's narrative began reporting on her prior record with the airline, including 2 previous complaints for unprofessional conduct, one from a passenger and one from a fellow crew member. For Amara, the most surreal part was watching the public opinion shift in real time. She could see it in the comment sections, in the headlines that now used words like disgraced and troubled history to describe Janet. One night, as she sat in her hotel room scrolling through the latest coverage, she felt her mother's hand on her shoulder. "How are you doing with all of this?" Selena asked. Amara shrugged. "It's strange. I didn't want her life to be ruined. I just wanted her to see she was wrong." Selena sat beside her. "Sometimes people can't see it, not until they're forced to, and sometimes they still don't." Amara stared at the glowing screen for a moment before setting the phone down. "Do you think she'll ever understand why this happened?" Her mother's eyes were steady. "Maybe, but whether she does or not, what matters is that the truth is on record, and that truth will help prevent this from happening to someone else." The legal fight was far from over, but Amara felt the weight of the moment, the sense that this was bigger than her, bigger than Janet, bigger even than this one flight. It was about the kind of spaces she and others would walk into in the future, and whether they would be made to feel they belonged. In the weeks that followed, the lawsuit remained in the headlines, but Gregory Stanton had no intention of letting the story be only about legal wrangling. He called Selena one morning with a new proposal, his tone brisk but thoughtful. "We need to take this beyond punishment," he said. "The public's watching. They want to see if we actually change anything. I think we can use this moment to make a statement about who we are as an airline and as an industry." Selena leaned back in her office chair. "Listening. I'm glad you're thinking that way. What do you have in mind?" "A mentorship program," Gregory said. "Scholarships for minority youth who want to enter aviation pilots, engineers, cabin crew, operations, paid internships, leadership training, the works. We'd name it after someone who stands for resilience and progress." Selena's gaze drifted toward the photo of her late husband on her desk. She thought about Amara and the way she had sat in that seat, unflinching, while every eye in the cabin pressed against her. "Name it after my husband," she said. "David Ellis Leadership Program." He believed in giving young people a fair start, no matter where they came from. Gregory didn't hesitate. Done. That afternoon, Selena met with Amara in their living room. The late winter sun streamed through the windows, and Amara sat cross-legged on the couch, scrolling through the Summit Group chat. "They want to name a new program after Dad," Selena said. Amara looked up, startled, because of what happened inspired by it. "Yes," Selena replied. "It would be a way to make sure your experience becomes a path for others, not just a cautionary tale." Amara set her phone aside. What would it do? Scholarships, mentorship, paid internships, all aimed at making aviation a place where young people of every background can see themselves. Selena's voice softened. "You wouldn't have to be involved, but I think you could be. Your voice could make it stronger." Amara hesitated. She'd been trying to slip back into normal life, but normal didn't feel the same anymore. "I don't know if I'm ready to be the face of something like that." "You don't have to be the face," Selena said, "just the spark." While they talked in their living room across the city, Janet Rourke sat with her lawyer reviewing a fresh stack of documents. The airline's counterclaim was gathering force, now supported by sworn statements from Thomas Avery, Isabella Cruz, and 2 additional passengers who had quietly come forward. Each statement chipped away at her defense, painting a picture of a pattern, not a one-off misunderstanding. Her lawyer tried to keep her focused. "We can still argue wrongful termination if we question the investigation process," he said, tapping the papers. "But the optics are getting harder. These passengers are credible." Janet's eyes flashed. "They're lying. They've all turned on me. Maybe," her lawyer said carefully, "or maybe they simply saw what they saw. Either way, we have to prepare for the possibility of losing. If that happens, the airline's going to seek damages." Back in Selena's office the next morning, Gregory arrived with his deputy and a folder full of drafts. The program's outline was ambitious partnerships with aviation schools, a summer leadership academy for high school students, and guaranteed interviews for graduates entering airline careers. "We want this to be more than a press release," Gregory said. "We want it to run for decades." Selena flipped through the pages, making notes in the margins. "Then make sure it's funded in perpetuity. Endow it so it doesn't die when leadership changes." Amara joined them halfway through the meeting. She listened quietly at first, then surprised them both by speaking up. "If we're doing this, I think we should include a mentorship network that pairs students with people in the industry who've experienced bias and overcame it. It's one thing to learn the technical skills. It's another to learn how to stand your ground when someone tries to push you out of your place." Gregory smiled faintly. "I like that. We'll build it in." News of the program leaked before they could even finalize the press materials. A reporter from a major national paper published an article titled "From Confrontation to Change: How a Flight Dispute Sparked an Aviation Diversity Push." The piece didn't name Amara directly, but referred to her as the passenger whose quiet resistance led to a reevaluation of airline policy. Selena read the article aloud that evening. Amara listened, a mix of pride and unease stirring in her chest. She had wanted the truth told, but hearing herself turned into a symbol still felt strange. The following week, Gregory hosted a press conference at the airline's headquarters. Selena and Amara attended, seated in the front row. Cameras clicked as Gregory outlined the David Ellis Leadership Program, speaking about the need for inclusivity and the responsibility corporations have to lead by example. Halfway through, he gestured toward the front row. "This program exists because of a moment of courage," he said. "A young woman who knew she belonged in her seat and stayed there reminded us all of the standards we must uphold. We honor that today." Amara felt the eyes of the room turn toward her. She didn't stand or wave, but she met their gaze, steady and unflinching, the way she had on the plane. Later, when the reporters swarmed Selena with questions, one asked, "Do you see this as a victory?" Selena's answer was measured. "It's a start. But real victory is when stories like my daughter's aren't remarkable anymore, when they simply don't happen." Meanwhile, Janet's lawyer tried to salvage her case by filing motions to delay the proceedings, citing media bias, but each delay seemed to make her less relevant. Public interest had shifted toward the new program, with students and educators praising the initiative. By the end of the month, applications for the first scholarships were already pouring in. Gregory's team began shortlisting candidates, and Selena insisted that Amara review the essays, even if she didn't make the final decisions. One essay in particular caught Amara's attention. It was from a girl her age who wrote about loving airplanes since childhood, but never seeing anyone who looked like her in the cockpit. She wrote, "Maybe if I get there, another little girl will see me and believe she belongs too." Amara closed the laptop slowly. She realized that what had happened to her was no longer just about her. It was becoming part of something larger, something that might outlast them all. That night, as she lay in bed, she thought of the seat in first class, of Janet's voice telling her to move, of the stillness she had chosen instead, and for the first time she felt the weight of it shift, not as a burden, but as a foundation. The airport smelled the same as it always had, a mix of brewed coffee, polished floors, and the faint tang of jet fuel drifting in from the tarmac. But to Amara Ellis, it felt like she was walking through it as a different person. A year had passed since the morning she refused to give up her seat in first class. In that time, her life had shifted in ways she never could have predicted. She rolled her carry-on toward the gate for her flight to Washington, D.C. The National Student Leadership Forum had invited her to speak about resilience and equity in education. She wasn't sure she was ready to be called a speaker, but she had learned that readiness wasn't always the deciding factor. Sometimes you stepped forward because the moment asked for it. As she approached the gate, she caught sight of a familiar logo on a poster mounted near the boarding area. The David Ellis Leadership Program. The name was printed in bold letters, with a photo of smiling students in front of an aircraft simulator. A line of text read, "Inspiring the next generation of leaders in aviation." Amara slowed to look at it. She recognized one of the faces on the poster, a girl named Kiara, who had been in the very first class of scholarship recipients. She remembered reading Kiara's application essay, the one about wanting to be a pilot so that little girls who looked like her could believe they belonged in the cockpit. Her phone buzzed with a notification. It was a message from Selena. "Proud of you today. Remember to take a deep breath before you speak. You've earned every seat you sit in." Amara smiled faintly. Her mother was back in Chicago, running her company and still serving on the advisory board for the leadership program. Gregory Stanton remained the program's most vocal champion, attending every graduation ceremony and insisting the funding be secured for at least 20 years. When boarding was called, Amara stepped forward with her first-class ticket. The gate agent scanned it and handed it back with a smile that seemed warmer than the standard customer service expression. "Welcome aboard, Ms. Ellis." The jet bridge was quiet, the air cool against her face. She entered the cabin and found her seat 2A this time and stowed her bag. The leather felt familiar beneath her fingers, but the weight in her chest was different. She no longer felt like she had to prove she belonged here. She simply knew it. As passengers filed in, she pulled out her phone and opened the program's website. Photos from the latest mentorship weekend filled the screen. Students touring an aircraft maintenance hangar, trying out flight simulators, sitting in roundtable discussions with pilots and engineers. She tapped on one picture and saw a caption, "Kiara Simmons, scholarship recipient, shares her journey from program applicant to private pilot license holder." Amara's chest warmed. She didn't know Kiara personally, but seeing her there, smiling in the cockpit of a training plane, felt like watching a seed bloom into something strong. The seat beside her remained empty until the last few minutes of boarding. A middle-aged man in a tailored suit placed his briefcase in the overhead bin and sat down. He glanced at her, recognition flickering in his eyes. "You're Amara Ellis, aren't you?" She nodded. "Yes." He smiled. "I read about you last year. My niece applied to the Ellis program. She didn't get in, but she said just the idea of it made her think about possibilities she'd never considered." Amara felt a quiet pride. "That means a lot to hear." The man adjusted his seatbelt. "I just wanted to say thank you. You turned a bad moment into something that's helping people." The engines hummed as the crew prepared for departure. Amara glanced toward the galley, where a flight attendant was speaking to the lead purser. She caught a glimpse of a younger woman with a warm expression, and for a brief second, she thought of Isabella Cruz. During takeoff, Amara watched the city fall away beneath them, the skyline catching the morning light. The hum of the engines settled into a steady rhythm, and she opened her notebook. She still carried it everywhere, the same one she had filled the night of the incident with every detail she could remember. Now, a year later, the pages were filled with new entries, notes from program board meetings, reflections from speaking engagements, even fragments of conversations with students who had told her how much it meant to see her stand her ground. She began to write. Not about the flight a year ago, but about today, about how it felt to walk onto a plane without the tight knot of anxiety in her stomach, about how the world seemed both bigger and smaller now. When the flight attendants came through with drinks, Amara ordered tea. The warmth seeped into her hands, and she thought about her father, about the lessons Selena had carried forward, about the quiet defiance that had started this chapter of her life. Midway through the flight, she checked her email and saw a message from Gregory. The subject line read, "First Year Impact Report." She downloaded the attachment. The numbers were clear: over 200 applications in the first year, 20 scholarships awarded, 15 mentorships that had already led to internships in aviation companies. The report included quotes from participants, and one in particular caught her eye because of this program. "I walked into my first day as an engineering intern knowing I belonged there." Amara leaned back, the corners of her mouth lifting. That was it. That was the whole point. As the plane began its descent into Washington, the sun broke through the clouds, washing the cabin in gold. Amara closed her notebook and tucked it into her bag. She felt the gentle pull of gravity as they lowered toward the runway, the city coming into view. When they landed and the seatbelt sign went off, the man beside her turned again. "Good luck at your event," he said. "Thank you," she replied. "And tell your niece not to give up. The next application cycle starts soon." Walking through the terminal, she passed a group of teenagers wearing matching jackets embroidered with the logo of an aviation academy. They were laughing, pulling rolling bags, and talking excitedly about their flight. One of them glanced at her and did a double take. "Hey," the girl said softly to her friend, "I think that's her." Amara didn't stop, but she smiled to herself. If they knew her story, maybe it would remind them that a single moment of standing still could change more than they imagined. The conference ballroom was filled with rows of chairs, the hum of quiet conversation blending with the clinking of coffee cups from the refreshment table at the back. Amara stood near the stage, her notes folded neatly in her hands. The organizers had given her 10 minutes to speak, but she knew the real challenge wasn't the time limit. It was how to tell a story that had grown beyond her without losing the truth of what it had been. She took a deep breath and stepped to the podium. The microphone adjusted with a small squeak. The audience of students, educators, and community leaders turned toward her, the low buzz of conversation fading into silence. "My name is Amara Ellis," she began. "A year ago, I boarded a flight like any other passenger. I had my ticket, my seat assignment, and a plan for where I was going. But somewhere between the gate and cruising altitude, I became a problem in the eyes of someone who had decided I didn't belong where I was sitting." She paused, letting the words settle. She saw a few heads nodding, others leaning forward slightly. I was asked to move. Politely at first, then more firmly. The reason wasn't that my ticket was invalid, or that someone else needed the seat. The reason was wrapped in something harder to name, the kind of bias that hides behind the word protocol. Amara told them about refusing to move, about the stillness she had chosen instead of confrontation, about the call to the CEO and the flight attendant's removal. She didn't dwell on the humiliation, but she didn't erase it either. She wanted them to understand that the moment had been both small and enormous, a single seat on a single flight, and yet a turning point that had rippled outward for months. "What happened after was bigger than me," she said. "The airline changed its policies. They started a scholarship program in my father's name to bring more young people into aviation. I've met students whose dreams now have a runway they didn't have before. And I've learned something I didn't expect, that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to be moved from the place you've earned." She closed with a quiet "thank you," stepped back from the podium, and heard the room fill with applause. It wasn't the thunderous kind that comes from a big reveal or a rousing call to action. It was warm, steady, and real. Afterward, as people mingled, a young woman approached her. She couldn't have been more than 16, with wide eyes and a notebook clutched to her chest. "Ms. Ellis," she said softly, "I'm applying to the Ellis program next year. Hearing you talk today, it makes me believe I can do it." Amara smiled. "You can, and when you get there, you'll make it easier for the next person." They spoke for a few more minutes before the girl was pulled away by a friend. Amara stayed a little longer, meeting more students, answering questions, and listening to their stories. That evening, she boarded her return flight. It was a smaller plane this time, the kind with 2 seats on each side of the aisle. She found her spot by the window and watched the ground crew moving below, their reflective vests catching the glow of the floodlights. The boarding process was uneventful, almost quiet compared to the day that had changed so much for her. But as she settled in, she found herself glancing at the flight attendants, noting their body language, their tone with passengers. She realized she would probably always notice these things now. When the engines roared to life and the plane began to taxi, she rested her head against the seat and let her eyes close. She thought about the past year, the media storm, the meetings, the program's first class of scholars, the letters she had received from strangers who saw their own experiences reflected in hers. She thought about Janet Rourke, not with anger anymore, but with a kind of detached curiosity. She wondered if Janet had reflected on that day, if she had come to see how her actions looked from the other side. She might never know, and she decided she didn't need to. Somewhere above the clouds, with the cabin lights dimmed and the steady hum of the engines around her, Amara felt the quiet strength she had carried that day settle in her chest again. She had learned that justice wasn't just about exposing what was wrong, it was about building something better in its place. The seatbelt sign came on as they began their descent. Amara looked out the window at the city lights scattered below like constellations. The world was still full of places where she might be told she didn't belong, but she knew now that she could meet those moments with calm, with resolve, and with the knowledge that one act of staying put could open doors for people she might never meet. As the wheels touched down, she felt a sense of completion. Not because the work was done, it wasn't, but because she had carried this story to a point where it could live beyond her. She walked through the terminal without hurry, her carry-on rolling behind her. A few people glanced at her, some with recognition, others without a clue who she was. It didn't matter. She knew who she was. Outside, the air was cool and clean. She paused for a moment before heading to the taxi line, letting the night wrap around her. Somewhere behind her, another plane was taking off, its engines lifting it into the dark sky. Amara smiled faintly. She thought of her father, of her mother's steady hand, of the students who would sit in seats they had earned without fear of being told to move. And she thought of the truth she now carried like a compass, that she belonged anywhere her ticket and her work took her. In the space of a single flight, Amara Ellis's quiet courage became more than a personal stand. It became a turning point. What began as an attempt to push her aside ended in systemic change, a scholarship program opening doors for young people across the country. and a reminder that justice is built one choice at a time.